Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As I run from death today, I would like to discuss the concept of radicalism and how it typically manifests itself. Many people see the word radical as a pejorative, and if they do, they're probably misunderstanding what it actually means. Some people believe that a radical is someone who is fanatical and prone to resort to violence. For instance, the idea that a radical Islamist is someone who is willing to blow people up and attack innocent civilians. And it's a correct characterization that certain Muslim fundamentalists are willing to do that. But I'm not sure that the word radical per se is what is at the root of this tendency. On the other hand, there's a view of the word radical as being associated with the far left of the political spectrum. This view of the political spectrum is one with respect to the status quo. That is, those who support the status quo in its present form, or a slightly earlier form, are considered conservatives. Those who want change are considered liberals. Those who want a reversion to a much older state are considered reactionaries. And those who want dramatic departure from the status quo are considered radicals. For some reason, the spectrum of views with respect to the status quo has been confused with the political right versus the political left. And somehow in this view, by definition, the political left wants change and the political right wants things to stay the same. If we look, though, at self-identified political left-wingers and political right-wingers, we see that that's not really the case. There are many instances of people on the political left favoring the status quo and people on the political right wanting change of one sort or another. So we can see clearly that conventional views of a radical as either a violent fanatic or a far leftist don't really make a lot of sense. Now, I would also submit that conventional dichotomies between right and left on the political spectrum don't make a lot of sense either. In today's world, politics has become more complex in some ways, but also the distinction has never really held much water even previously. Consider, for instance, that what was considered a liberal in the 19th century would be considered well on the political right today. On the other hand, a lot of today's self-proclaimed liberals and progressives actually hold views very similar to those of the British Tories in the early 19th century. So what is a radical? I would not say that someone who likes to inflict violence or dramatically disrupt the way things are by breaking them down in some kind of sudden upheaval is really much of a radical. You can call this person a militant, a fanatic, a destroyer. There are certainly many legitimate ways to criticize this kind of behavior, but I think the word radical is misplaced here. A radical is someone who looks at an issue at its root. That's actually the etymology of the word radical, of the root. So if you see an issue in terms of core principles and try to develop your position on the basis of those principles in some kind of systematic, philosophically consistent fashion, that makes you a radical. Now, just because you're a radical, that doesn't commit you to being for the status quo or against the status quo. But it does commit you to analyzing each situation on principle instead of just accepting what is by default. And when we look at that definition of the term radical, which is the correct definition, then we can see that radicalism is quite rare in any particular issue, but it's even rarer for multiple issues put together. That is, the majority of the world's population are not radicals in any sense. They think in terms of what is and try to tweak it here and there. What would be an incremental way of improving the political system? Well, you can lower taxes a little bit, you can raise them a little bit, and you might reform this particular government program or not. These are very status quo-oriented views, and some of them are certainly better than others. I don't mean to disparage this way of thinking altogether, because it certainly has its uses. However, what a radical would do in this kind of situation, when confronted with any kind of political or social or economic system, is ask, what is the way things ought to be, addressing the matter from first principles. How does the way things ought to be compare with the way things are? And how how can we get from the status quo to the way things ought to be? The mechanism can be incremental. There's room for realism and acknowledgement of what is possible given the entire set of circumstances one is faced with. But at the same time, a radical doesn't lose sight of the ultimate goal, of what it is that should be strived toward. And that really is the fundamental difference. Now, one can find a decent minority of people who are radicals about one issue or another. Just because of the issues that I have tended to concentrate on, I will give 3 examples. There are radicals on the subject of religion, people who look into whether or not the very basis of religious thinking is justified, and who question and ultimately reject it. Religious skepticism can come in various forms, of course, the clearest of which is outright atheism, but it need not even take that form. I am personally an atheist, and certainly in the world of today, an atheist is a kind of radical. Religion has very entrenched, established societal roots, and in some places of the world, political roots. And to reject that is to reject a dominant form of the status quo. But more importantly, it's to fail to automatically accept the way things are just because they are a certain way. Another kind of radicalism is political libertarianism. Political libertarianism, in its strict definition, there are a variety of flavors, seeks a government or a societal order, because some libertarians reject the concept of a government altogether. I'm not one of them, but a societal order whose fundamental principles entail non-aggression, a respect for the rights of every individual, and a focus on peaceful cooperation and exchange through the market mechanism. There can be a spectrum of views that would be compatible with this general ideal, but it's quite a radical ideal for this day and age. Consider that in most political systems, the government does a lot more than protect individual rights, enforce contracts, punish fraud and unfair business practices, and provide the rudiments of defense. Instead, there are large redistributionist welfare states that control the money supply, that engage in massive borrowing and inflation, and that routinely violate the rights of their subjects through wars on certain substances or wars on certain people. So clearly, if you were to look at the status quo, you can say, well, I want the government to change in this way or that way, and it's certain that some of these changes would be quite desirable. If you ended the drug war, but left everything else the same, that would be an improvement. If you ended the war in Iraq, left everything else the same, that would be an improvement. But what a libertarian sees is a very different desirable role for government or whatever network of agencies are responsible for these essential functions of protecting individual rights. And a libertarian could say, well, I favor certain measures as getting me closer to that ideal, but I will never lose sight of that ideal. A third kind of radicalism with which I have been involved is indefinite life extension. Now, it's very true, and unavoidably so, that in the status quo, there has so far not been a single person to attain an indefinite lifespan. And it seems, given empirical observation, that very few people can expect to live beyond the age of 100, and virtually no one beyond the age of 123 or so, to take into account that the oldest known human being died at the age of 122. But this is given today's state of medical technology. Most people, be they religious or secular, accept this as an inevitable reality. They see that there's an upper limit on their lives. Even though that upper limit has actually increased over time, most people don't really have that historical perspective either. They accept it as the way things are, and most people are typically fine with incremental measures like curing cancer or creating new ways of fighting heart disease, performing better heart surgeries, and those are, of course, very important advances to pursue. But a radical for indefinite life extension sees an ultimate goal of lifting that upper limit, because there's nothing really in the laws of nature that require a particular individual to expire after a certain time. There are creatures which either do not senesce at all or senesce at a much slower rate than human beings do. So it's clearly not ruled out by the laws of biology. And it's also clearly not ruled out that the progress of medical science can eradicate some formerly ubiquitous perils. And it may indeed be that a series of incremental improvements will be what ultimately paves the way for indefinite human life extension. But what a radical sees is this progression as having a much larger goal. So these three examples of radicalism are just a sampling. There are many other kinds of radicalism out there, both good and bad, depending on the series of principles one adopts and the kinds of fundamental values that one chooses and upon which one extrapolates from a radical perspective. The way I see it, a rejection of certain ways of religious thinking, certain kinds of government oppression, and of death itself stems from a mindset that affirms the desirability of human life and human flourishing. There are radical ways of thinking, on the other hand, that value the opposite. For example, there are some who would say that there is virtue in suffering, or that there is virtue in a collective unity that subordinates the individual to itself. That would also be a kind of radicalism, and it's possible to develop a very different ideal of the world from that. In some respects, of course, because there can only be one true set of fundamental principles, there's a contradiction or mistake in those kinds of views. However, it's quite possible to take those mistaken views and develop a whole system on the basis of them. So there can be good radicalism and bad radicalism.